Entwined is a podcast about how so much of the world around us is wound or twisted together. This podcast strives to bear unexposed or indiscernible connections using historical and anecdotal sources. I am P.S. McKay, and along with Elliot Gladstone, this is Entwined. I am the monarch of all I survey. My right there is none to dispute. From the center all round to the sea, I am lord of the fowl and the brute. That poem was written in response to the story of a man who conquered nature. It described him as some sort of king, one who possesses the power over all under him. I find it interesting that he was celebrated like that. Throughout all of our history, nations rose and fell under the aspersions of how certain people should be in power over others. Stories are made of people gripping and wresting power away, and we celebrate that in one form or another. Usually it is considered good when a new power or king comes after vanquishing the old. But when you think back and realize that history is written by the winners, I can't help but feel that there is a bit of a bias there. The War of the Spanish Succession took place between 1701 and 1715, and was a major European conflict of the early 18th century over who should be the next Spanish king. It started over whether a Bourbon or a Habsburg would take control of Spain's very extensive possessions, with a coalition of the Habsburg monarchy, the Dutch Republic, England, Scotland, and Prussia supporting the Habsburg candidate, opposed by France, and Bavaria supporting the Bourbon candidate. Now, Bourbon from the Bourbon region of France. Keep that in mind. After some early Allied successes, the war produced a long military stalemate and ended with the Treaty of Utrecht, which was based on a balance of power in Europe. The war was triggered by the death in 1700 of the last Habsburg king of Spain, the infirm and childless Charles II. He had reigned over a vast global empire, and the question of who would succeed him had long troubled ministers and capitals throughout Europe. Attempts to solve the problem by partitioning the empire between the eligible candidates from the royal houses of France, Bourbon, Austria, the House of Habsburg, and Bavaria, Wittelsbach, ultimately failed, and on his deathbed, Charles II fixed the entire Spanish inheritance on Philip, Duke of Anjou, the second eldest grandson of King Louis XIV of France. With Philip ruling in Spain, Louis XIV would secure great advantages to his dynasty, but some statesmen regarded a dominant house of Bourbon as more of a threat to the European stability, jeopardizing the balance of power. Louis XIV had good reasons for accepting his grandson on the Spanish thrones, but he subsequently made a series of controversial moves. He sent troops to secure the Spanish Netherlands, which happened to be the buffer zone between France and the Dutch Republic. He sought to dominate the Spanish-American trade at the expense of English and Dutch merchants, and he refused to remove Philip from the French line of succession, thereby opening the possibility of France and Spain uniting under a single powerful monarch at a future date. To counter Louis XIV's growing dominance, England, the Dutch Republic, and Austria, together with their allies in the Holy Roman Empire, reformed the Grand Alliance in 1701, and this was supported by Emperor Leopold I's claim to the whole Spanish inheritance for his second son, Archduke Charles. By backing the Habsburg candidate, known to his supporters as King Charles III of Spain, each member of the coalition sought to reduce the power of France. Remember, France is the bad guy here. And this was to ensure their own territorial dynastic security and restore and improve the trade opportunities that they all enjoyed under Charles II. The Austrians, the Dutch, and English allies formally declared war in May of 1702. There were many in the meantime who would take part in the war, along with a man by the name of Alexander Selkirk. He was the son of a shoemaker and tanner in Lower Largo, Fife, Scotland, born in 1676. In his youth, he displayed a quarrelsome and unruly disposition. He was summoned before the Kirk session in August of 1693 for his, quote, indecent conduct in church, end quote. But he did not appear for being gone to sea. He was back at Largo in 1701 when he again came to the attention of church authorities for beating up his brothers. Early on, he was engaged in buccaneering, otherwise known as piracy. Now, when pirates come to mind, the only thing most people can think of is Captain Jack Sparrow, or Blackbeard, or Captain Barbossa, walking around with weird mannerisms and a certain kind of pirate code. That's not at all how pirates worked. Yes, Blackbeard was real, and so were many others, but the stereotype of the pirate look, that was the concoction of the book Treasure Island by Scottish author Robert Louis Stevenson. It was responsible not only for the typical things like "Yarr" or walking the plank, but also how X marks the spot on a map, and even how pirates should have a parrot. It's funny, but after such long passages of time, pirates in the cinematic form are nothing more than a parody of themselves based on a fiction of parody based on real life. If you Google a picture of him, he would never fit the pirate archetype, but he was considered El Drake among the Spanish, otherwise known as the Dragon. He so severely hurt the Spanish by looting its ships, and while he wasn't the sole cause of agitation from England against Spain, he was a figurehead, and it prompted Spain to send a massive armada to invade England in 1588. And that pirate was placed as second in command of the dwarfed English fleet. Only the battle never really came. Before Spain's ships could reach the English coast, a massive storm disrupted the fleet, causing most of the armada to be sent off course, become unusable, and permanently damage the Spanish Empire from there on out. Spain was never able to recover, and piracy, or privateering, was considered a good way of keeping the balance of power with minimal infrastructure. Alexander Selkirk joined an expedition of English privateer and explorer William Dampier to the South Sea, setting sail from Kinsale in Ireland on the 11th of September, and they carried letters of marque from the Lord High Admiral authorizing their armed merchant ships to attack foreign enemies as the War of the Spanish Succession was then going on between England and Spain. Dampier was the captain of St. George, and Selkirk served on Cinque Port, St. George's companion ship, as sailing master under Captain Thomas Stradling. By this time, Selkirk must have had considerable experience at sea. In September 1704, after parting ways with Dampier, Captain Stradling brought Cinque Port to an island known to the Spanish as Ma a Tierra, located on the uninhabited Juan Fernandez archipelago 420 miles off the coast of Chile, and it was for a mid-expedition restocking of fresh water and supplies. Selkirk had grave concerns about the seaworthiness of their vessel, and probably wanted to make the needed repairs before going any further. He declared that he would rather be left on Juan Fernandez than continue in a dangerously leaky ship. Stradling granted his request and landed Selkirk and his personal effects on the island. Now, Selkirk regretted his rashness, but Stradling refused to let him back on board. Cinque Port did indeed later founder off the coast of what is now Colombia. Stradling and some of his crew survived the loss of their ship, but were forced to surrender to the Spanish, and the survivors were taken to Peru, where they endured a harsh imprisonment. At first, Selkirk remained along the shoreline of Juan Fernandez. During this time, he ate spiny lobsters and scanned the ocean daily for rescue, suffering all the while from loneliness, misery, and remorse. Hordes of raucous sea lions gathered on the beach for mating season, and eventually drove him to the island's interior. Once inland, his way of life took a turn for the better. More foods were available there. Feral goats, introduced by earlier sailors, provided him with meat and milk. Wild turnips, cabbage leaves, and dried pepper berries offered a variety and spice. Rats would attack him at night, but he was able to sleep soundly and in safety by domesticating and living near feral cats. Selkirk proved resourceful in using materials that he found on the island. He forged a new knife out of barrel hoops left on the beach. He built 2 huts out of pepper trees, one of which he used for cooking and the other for sleeping. And he also employed his musket to hunt goats and his knife to clean their carcasses. As his gunpowder dwindled, he had to chase prey on foot. During one such chase, he was badly injured when he tumbled from a cliff, lying helpless and unable to move for about a day. His prey had cushioned his fall, probably sparing him a broken neck. Childhood lessons learned from his father, a tanner, now served him well. For example, when his clothes wore out, he made new ones from hair-covered goatskins using a nail for sewing. His shoes became unusable, and he had no need to replace them since his toughened, calloused feet made protection unnecessary. He sang psalms and read from the Bible, finding it a comfort in his situation and a prop for his English. During his sojourn on the island, 2 vessels came to anchor, but unfortunately for Selkirk, they were both Spanish. As a Scotsman and a privateer, he risked a grim fate if captured, and therefore tried to hide himself. On one occasion, he was spotted and chased by a group of sailors from one of the ships. His pursuers even urinated beneath the tree in which he was hiding, but failed to discover him. Frustrated, his would-be captors gave up and sailed away. Selkirk's long-awaited deliverance came on February 2nd, 1709, by way of Duke, a privateering ship piloted by William Dampier, and its sailing companion, Duchess. Thomas Dover led the landing party that met Selkirk. After 4 years and 4 months without human company, Selkirk was almost incoherent with joy. The Duke's captain and leader of the expedition was Woodes Rogers, who mischievously referred to him as the governor of the island. The agile castaway caught 2 or 3 goats a day and helped restore the health of Rogers' men who were suffering from scurvy. Captain Rogers was impressed by Selkirk's physical vigor and also by the peace of mind that he had attained while living on the island, observing, quote, "One may see that solitude and retirement from the world is not such an insufferable state of life as most men imagine, especially when people are fairly called or thrown into it unavoidably, as this man was." He made Selkirk the Duke's second mate, later giving him command of one of their prize ships, Increase, before it was ransomed by the Spanish. Selkirk returned to privateering with a vengeance. At present-day Ecuador, he led a boat crew up the Guayas River, where a number of wealthy Spanish ladies had fled, and relieved them of their gold and jewels they had hidden inside their clothing. His part in the hunt for treasure galleons along the coast of Mexico resulted in the capture of the Bachelor, on which he served as sailing master under Captain Dover to the Dutch East Indies. Selkirk completed the around-the-world voyage by the Cape of Good Hope as sailing master of Duke, arriving at the Downs off the English coast on October 1st of 1711. He had been away for 8 years, to a changed country. It should be noted that the English did not fare very well in the beginning of the War of Succession, the year that Selkirk left. Numerous losses piled up, and there were minimal incidents to be excited about with regard to the war, and for many in the country a divine sign of relevancy of their struggle made itself known in late 1703, the same year that Selkirk joined the fight. The Great Storm of 1703 was a destructive extratropical cyclone that struck central and southern England on December 7th of 1703. High winds caused 2,000 chimney stacks to collapse in London, and winds damaged the New Forest, which lost 4,000 oaks. Ships were blown hundreds of miles off course, and over 1,000 seamen died on the Goodwin Sands alone. News bulletins of casualties and damage were sold all over England, a novelty at the time. The Church of England declared that the storm was God's vengeance for the sins of the nation. In the English Channel, fierce winds and high seas swamped some vessels outright and drove others onto the Goodwin Sands, an extensive sandbank situated along the southeast coast of England, and the traditional anchorage for ships waiting either for passage up the Thames estuary to London or for favorable winds to take them out into the Channel and the Atlantic Ocean. The Royal Navy was badly affected, losing 13 ships, including the entire Channel Squadron, and upwards of 1,500 seamen drowned. Daniel Defoe, a contemporary of the budding industry of journalism at the time, produced his full-length book, The Storm, in response to the calamity, calling it the tempest that destroyed woods and forests all over England. He wrote, "No pen could describe it, no tongue express it, nor thought conceive it, unless by one in the extremity of it. Coastal towns such as Portsmouth, quote, looked as if the enemy had sacked them, and were most miserably torn to pieces," end quote. Winds of up to 80 miles per hour destroyed more than 400 windmills. Defoe reported that the sails on some turned so fast that the friction caused the wood wheels to overheat and catch fire. He thought that the destruction of the sovereign fleet was a punishment for their poor performance against the Catholic armies of France and Spain during the first year of the War of Spanish Succession. For even with all their might and power, nations of England and Spain were still inconsequential to the power of nature, and just 2 storms nearly brought them to their knees at very crucial moments in their histories. Daniel Defoe was born in 1660 and was an English trader, writer, journalist, pamphleteer, and spy. He was a prolific and versatile writer, producing more than 500 books, pamphlets, and journals on various topics including politics, crime, religion, marriage, psychology, and even the supernatural. He was also a pioneer of economic journalism. Defoe's early life, he experienced some of the most unusual occurrences in English history. In 1665, 70,000 were killed by the Great Plague of London. The next year, the Great Fire of London left standing only Defoe's and 2 other houses in his neighborhood. In 1667, when he was probably 7, a Dutch fleet sailed up the Medway via the River Thames and attacked the town of Chatham in the raid on the Medway. His mother, Annie, had died by the time that he was about 10. Defoe was an outspoken nonconformist as an adult, and was responsible for numerous pamphlet publications criticizing the monarchy and Parliament. He was a natural target of Queen Anne, and was thrown into jail for seditious libel. Not exactly freedom of the press at the time, but then again, this was when modern journalism was beginning to develop as more and more of the public became literate. With that being said, Defoe was a fan of a new style of printing. Up until that time, the typical way of publishing writings was by way of pamphlets. They were small, easy to mass produce, and get out at a faster rate. But Defoe was on the forefront of the novel, a longer epic that could be mass-produced for the greater public. And despite his clear opposition to many things in Parliament, he worked his way into the good graces of the government and played the role of spy for the British. He went to Scotland and embedded himself with the anti-Unionists. This was a perilous position. If he had been found out, there would not have been any hesitation in having him drawn and quartered for his treachery. But he was fantastic at his job, eventually securing a position in the Scottish Parliament and fostering a more pro-Union sentiment steering the Scots away from independence. He eventually used the method of the novel to write The History of the Union, which explained the history behind the need for unification between England and Scotland. To simplify in the most overstated terms, unity was preserved. By 1708, the Duke of Marlborough and Prince Eugene of Savoy had secured victory in the Spanish Netherlands and in Italy, and had defeated Louis XIV's ally Bavaria. France faced invasion, but the unity of the Allies broke first. With the Grand Alliance defeated in Spain, its casualties and costs mounting and aims diverging, the Tories came to power in Great Britain in 1710 and resolved the end of the war. French and British ministers prepared the groundwork for a peace conference, and in 1712, Britain ceased combat operations. The Dutch, Austrians, and German states fought on to strengthen their own negotiating position, but defeated by Marshal Villars, they were soon compelled to accept the Anglo-French mediation. By the terms of the treaties, the Spanish Empire was partitioned between the major and minor powers. The Austrians received most of Spain's former European realms, but the Duke of Anjou retained peninsular Spain and Spanish America, where, after renouncing his claim to the French succession, he reigned as King Philip V. The European balance of power was restored, and it was a mere 2 years after Alexander Selkirk returned to his native land of England. He returned to a hero's welcome. Numerous writers conveyed his many exploits and documented his time on the island, fending for himself. He was even deemed to be a monarch of all he saw. And that meant something. That meant that while nature was strong, man was stronger and could find a way. But is that really a fair interpretation? He would eventually set out to sea again, this time, ironically, on anti-piracy patrols off the coast of Africa. This is where he came down with a severe case of yellow fever, and it won the battle. Alexander Selkirk, on December 13th of 1721, died at the age of 45. Nature won out in the end, as it did against Spain during the Great Spanish Armada, and it did again against England in the Great Storm of 1703. It is a cautionary tale in which we weave our history. Kings will live and die, administrations will rise and fall, nations will change, and borders are but a man-made construct. In reality, our society is meant to keep out the very nature in which we live, to not be at its mercy. And we may stave it off here and there, but there will always be a bigger wave, a bigger storm that will bring us to our knees again. Nature always wins. And one final thought. As for Alexander Selkirk, you may know his more fictional character version, made famous by the prolific writer Daniel Defoe, as Robinson Crusoe. Selkirk fought vehemently against the island to survive another day, to which he did. And while nature took him as it will all of us, he still lives on in the form of that island castaway that has enriched all of our lives in some form or another. Such works as the aforementioned Treasure Island, as well as the Swiss Family Robinson, Tom Hanks' Castaway, and even Lost in Space. Maybe it is ideas that transcend and immortalize, for we still celebrate Selkirk's tenacity, even if it comes in so many forms. Maybe our ideas give us the ability to stay immortal and keep nature in the checkmate we've always desired. Thank you for listening. Entwined is a podcast that releases every other week, and is written, recorded, and produced by P.S. McKay and Elliot Gladstone. This episode was written by P.S. McKay. Please tune in next time to see what Elliot Gladstone has in store for us. For more information about the show and the authors, please check out entwinedpodcast.com or visit our Twitter page @entwinedpodcast.